So I'm going to make a series of what might be unpopular claims through the course of this lecture, but I do so in the hope that it will bring us to an understanding. You need to remove about where the Belarusian nationhood is today in 2023 and where it goes from here. And I deliberately say an understanding, not the understanding. So the lecture comprises 4 components. First of all, I want to recap some of the factors that erupted in the mass street protests in 2020. And then secondly, seeing this as a moment of political and national awakening, I want to say something about nation building in Belarus up to and since then. And I'll try to do that fairly quickly because I think people will be most interested in hearing about the Belarusian nation in context of the war. So thirdly, I will think about 2 issues: how the war in Ukraine has affected this political and national awakening of 2020, and also how Belarusians have responded to the war. And that includes thinking about the question of whether it makes sense to think of Belarus today as a sovereign state. And finally, I will turn to the question of outside actors and their policy positions on Belarus against this backdrop of war. And that should leave us in a good place in Q&A to address any questions of where next for the Belarusians and the Belarus nation. So while I'm a little reluctant to speculate about the future, I will end with 3 scenarios for the transition of a future transition of power. So firstly, many of you have views, opinions, and arguments about what caused this stalled revolution in August around the protests of 2020, which was a very real outburst of passion and bravery by the Belarusians. So the protests had grown through the summer, and then after the presidential election in August, we saw on some days perhaps 300,000 people take to the streets. So I would identify 4 groups of factors that brought Belarus to this moment. I don't think we can overlook economic factors. Lukashenko's cheerleaders like to talk about an economic miracle in the 1990s, but that was very much the lack of liberalizing, privatizing, and modernizing reforms in Belarus were only pushing economic problems down the road, even if GDP in the short term was growing. And people largely accepted Lukashenko's the state of the economy under Lukashenko, all the while pensions were being paid and they were being provided with a basic standard of living. But living standards had become very stagnant come the 2010s, and the economic problems were becoming much more pronounced. But these economic problems were long running. And it doesn't make sense to think of them as the most important cause of what happened in 2020, certainly not a sufficient cause, because you run into the problem of why then? Why weren't there mass protests in 2015 when the economic situation was not obviously much better? So that brings us to policy factors, which I would argue state policy exacerbated the economic problems. So the best example here in the short term, in the immediate term, was to think of the response to COVID-19 in the months leading up to the election. As you'll remember, Lukashenko dismissed COVID as a psychosis, and there were very minimal state responses to the pandemic. And it sent the wrong message to society. it became very obvious that people they were being lied to about the mortality rate. And so this added to the grievances against the state. And this links to the third group of factors, which is social factors. So one feature of COVID-19 was that it brought digital activism to the fore and new forms of social organisation. So crowdfunding helped show that society didn't need the state to deal with social problems, and Telegram and instant messaging apps thrived during crisis, and these would be really helpful later during the protests around the election day in August. But also we could see, I think, a growing willingness to protest. While there had been protests around the 2001, 2006 and 2010 elections, nothing was on anything like the scale of 2020. And I think the 2017, when the government tried to introduce what was effectively a tax on the unemployed, was quite interesting here, the so-called social parasites tax. So there we started to see people that weren't typically coming out onto the streets to protest, people in regional centres coming out and protesting against the regime. And as well, there were small protests at the end of 2019 against integration with Russia in the Union State framework. And these were interesting because of their proximity to what comes next. And also because Sergei Tsikhanovsky was one of the key figures in those protests, and it's his wife, Svetlana, that, who has her name on the ballot paper 8 or 9 months later. And so this digital activism and this growing willingness to protest can also be connected to the idea that there was a generational shift. It was younger generations bringing new ideas with them. And this links to the last factor I want to point to, which was the human factor. An out-of-touch leader who was at odds with the modernising forces in being carried by younger generations. And it seems, I think it's not controversial to say that Lukashenko has a fairly fixed economic mindset, and this was lagging behind the times. And the most obvious thing to point to here would be the IT sector, clearly somewhere where Belarusians were showing themselves innovative, capable of being world-leading. And it's not, I would suggest that Lukashenko's economic mindset meant that he probably didn't grasp how sectors like IT could contribute to economic growth, putting distance between him and society. So together, these various factors combine into a mounting and diverse set of grievances against the state. And ultimately, there's no institutional release valve for these grievances. And so the protests in 2020, in my mind, come to solve something of a collective action problem. Now there's a focal point for people expressing and airing their grievances, even if their grievances themselves are dissimilar to one another's. So the grievance of pensioners and IT workers, for example, are not the same, but the protest brought them together across the streets. So this is perhaps my first, might be an unpopular claim, but I want to say that 2020 was not about leadership. It was more about a popular mood, a spirit of the times, and this political and national awakening that I mentioned earlier. The opposition has traditionally been quite divided, and in some ways I would suggest that they were no more united in 2020 than they had been in previous elections. In the run-up to 2020, a lot of opposition groups were not falling in line behind the idea of a consensus candidate, for example. In that context, it's worth recalling where Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya came from. She was not intending to stand and not intending to put herself forward as for the election. It was her husband, Sergei, who wanted to stand, but the authorities are putting him in and out of prison, and so he's denied registration. And so along with Maria Kolesnikova and Veronika Tsepkala, this trio of women come to encapsulate the ambitions and the hopes of Belarusians. And they brought welcome international attention onto Belarus. But they were not so much leading the protests. I think these need to be seen as largely spontaneous. And the fact that protests could continue after Tsikhanovskaya left the country show us that her leadership was not integral. Likewise, the fact that other figureheads of the opposition were in prison and the protests kept continuing. The protests did not stop. And importantly, they were not putting forward a full-fledged political program. They were promising a free and fair election subsequently. And so they became a sort of catch-all option. They embody this zeitgeist. It converges on them rather than them leading it, in my view. And this tells us something very simple. People just wanted to change. So Tsikhanovskaya solves this collective action problem rather than supplying leadership. So I would argue that come 2020, people were withdrawing their support from the Lukashenko political model en masse. There's always been protest against him, but I would suggest that begrudgingly or happily that a majority, or he did get a majority in the 2006, 2010 and 2015 elections, but it's clearly getting tighter and tighter. So this is polling from the Independent Institute for Socioeconomic and Political Studies, which had been closed down before 2020. And this is asking about how, this is reported votes. So it's different from approval for Lukashenko. So for example, in 2010, approval ratings for Lukashenko according to ISEPs were 39%. So approval is always below that. But this downward trend, combined with the upsurge in activism that we saw around the election, it clearly suggests that Lukashenko couldn't have got a majority in 2020. Though, since I've suggested the opposition still had some divisions within it, I have to say I'm not convinced that anyone got a majority. I write that in the book, so I'm on record saying it. There were other candidates on the ballot paper, right? And there was the against all option. The next slide, please. So I describe this as a political and national awakening. So a political model is stronger where there's a coherent nation. People are then more likely to accept the political system. And given Belarus's short history as a nation state, this has been a vexed issue, and social cohesion has been challenging in Belarus. So I would suggest that people around Lukashenko and in the regime grasped the basic point that they needed to build a nation. So in my book, I call their project an East-oriented nation-building project. One tied very closely to Russia. And so one of the components of this is emphasizing the idea of three Slavic brotherly peoples of Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Russians. Importantly, Lukashenko tries to build it on the Soviet legacy, and in particular, the Soviet partisan resistance during World War II, during the Great Patriotic War, World War II. And so he sort of tries to make the partisan story the foundational myth of a nation. Well, that's fairly obviously problematic because it valorizes the Soviet Union, which is an empire, not a nation state. At the very least, it's a multi-nation state, not a nation state. And foundational myths usually fate a nation, not a polity in which the nation is, well, a subaltern component part. And after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the vulnerabilities in that nation building project become apparent. So in Lukashenko's eyes, we might think that Russia has violated an implicit part of the pact between these three brotherly nations, though Lukashenko's most vitriolic rhetoric is reserved for Ukrainians. It's not, I mean, it's not entirely that Lukashenko's nation-building project is impossible. It's that Putin's Russia is hell-bent on suppressing any expressions of Belarusian identity and intent on building some notion at the time of it was referred to as the Russian world that includes Belarusians. So the only way to push back against that is to focus on different national history, something that makes Russia the other. And so after 2014, we see a greater sanction of expressions of elements of Belarus's history by the state that are not connected to Russia. And this must have sanction from the authorities because they're not stamping it out. I mean, it goes back a bit earlier than 2014, but that's when it becomes more significant. And so we started seeing greater expression of history, symbols and materials related to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, for example. So in the tumult of 2020, we then get society asserting this identity much more vociferously. And Tsikhanovskaya surrounds herself in the paraphernalia of the white, red, white flag and the traditional oppositional nation-building materials. I would say that at the same time, Tsikhanovskaya is not denouncing Russia. So after the election, she and those around her form a coordination council for the transfer of power. And one of their first pronouncements publicly is that Belarus is not going to reorient its foreign policy, for example. This is significant because it shows us that people in the Belarus opposition are not persuaded that Russia is a massive problem at this point. It's only really after Russia invades Ukraine in 2022 that Tsikhanovskaya starts talking about Belarus as being occupied by Russia. And so far more, but after 2020, far more people become nationally conscious in line with these historical materials that are connected to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But because on the other hand, we have the brutal crackdown on protests, we get this sort of arrested or frozen development of this national or political awakening. And Lukashenko has been repressing this ever since. So a couple of points on the slide, I won't elaborate on them here. If people want me to, then we can do so in Q&A.
Another bottle.
So as is well known, Belarusian territory is used as one of the axes for Russia's invasion. It's from Belarus that tanks make a headlong dash for Kiev. And if
Dash is the wrong word. Sorry.
Tried to make a headlong dash for Kiev. And if Mr. Lukashenko knew anything about what was about to unfold, then he almost certainly thought that this would be over within a few days. He had said as much several times in the past. That didn't happen. It wasn't a dash, as Andrew points out. It was getting stuck in a long convoy, bottlenecked. And since then, Belarus has been, as a state, has been heavily involved in the war. From the beginning, missiles were fired from Belarusian territory into Ukraine. That's paused for quite some weeks around the autumn time, and then it sort of resumed again. Belarus has been providing ancillary services, treating wounded Russian soldiers in hospitals and some field hospitals. More recently, Belarusian territory has been used for the training of Russian soldiers, and air bases, such as one at Machilishi, which I'm about to mention in a moment, have been used by Russia. And most reportedly, Belarusian state agents were involved in cyber attacks against Ukraine's infrastructure. And most recently, Belarus has been involved in Russia's nuclear posturing. And I think there Lukashenko is more a useful idiot than a Putin puppet. He seems to want nuclear weapons. But so while it has not committed troops, it has done pretty much everything short of that. And it probably won't send its own troops. So Belarus has about 47,000 serving military personnel, combat readiness of which is questionable. And if you think that Russian soldiers' morale at the beginning of the war was a huge problem, Russians didn't seem to understand what they were supposed to be fighting for. Belarusians have even less understanding of that, I think. So those Belarusians that are motivated to fight in Ukraine are the ones who are joining the Ukrainian side as volunteers. And I think there's possibly a according to an article in Medusa towards the end of last year, there might be about 2,000 Belarusian volunteers, possibly slightly more than that. So then can we have the next slide, please? So then we come to the issues of public opinion. The most obvious effect has been that it has polarized society. We get some very different positions on the war. So there are the resigned. There are people who saw the war as a reason to perhaps drift back towards quietly supporting, not supporting, but accepting the Lukashenko regime. In most cases, I think these people are satisfied so long as Lukashenko keeps Belarus out of the war directly. In many cases, so there's a quarterly report called the Belarus Change Tracker, and that's shown growing satisfaction with the authorities' actions since February last year. More than 50% in each quarter since have shown some approval of, either strongly approve or somewhat approve of government actions. Now, I would say the author of that report is quite keen to point out that it might overestimate that figure because a lot of people drop out of the surveys. But it's that's a significant group. Then there's those who were perhaps the stronger protest element in 2020. For this group, the war confirms Lukashenko's illegitimacy and that his time is up soon. And so I'm calling these the hardened anti-Lukashenko cohort. And then there are yet others who are strong advocates of Russia's war. I'm calling these Belarus's Putin zealots. And I'm going to come back to these because I think these are a problem for Lukashenko. Can I have the next slide, please? So Chatham House, among others, has been doing its best to poll inside inside Belarus. The first question is, how far do Belarusians approve of Russia's military operation in Ukraine? Well, we can see that, so this is the data from the last poll conducted in March. So we can see that shows 32% approve, 44% disapproving. And this large, frustratingly large kind of area in the middle of 24% that makes interpretation a bit trickier. And there are other surveys that have found similar. I mean, I am aware of one that is more favorable to Russia, but I'm not, yeah, but this seems to be the best that we have. And note that compared to last year, these figures have not changed at all. Now, these are Likert scales, and I suppose if I'm being strict, I've collapsed strongly approve and somewhat approve, strongly disapprove. You might argue that there's been a very slight shift towards approval of action insofar as the number strongly approving has grown at the expense of those somewhat approving, and the number strongly disapproving has shrunk at the cost of those somewhat disapproving. But in essence, the data has not changed. And whether or not what the slight shift I just mentioned is statistically significant, I don't know. And there were clear signs of dissent for the situation from the beginning of the war. We saw the rail saboteurs, the rail partisans committing acts of sabotage, blowing up railway signal boxes, for example. And these were seem to have been coordinated by Paul, a group of former police and security officials who have been quite a significant element of the opposition to Lukashenko since 2020. And then earlier this year, Belarusian drone operators damaged a Russian surveillance plane on the ground in the airfield at Machilishi, just outside Minsk. Now the plane did limpingly fly off again back to Russia for repairs, but this dented the prestige of any image that Lukashenko damaged Lukashenko's image in terms of his role in supporting Russia in the war. But more significantly, in understanding anti-war sentiment, the question of should Belarus send troops to fight alongside Russia has been consistently around 3%. And the Belarus change tracker, which I just mentioned, breaks this down according to people's position on support for the authorities. And that finds that even among ardent supporters of the regime of Lukashenko, only 11% approve think Belarus should commit troops. So that corroborates the data from Chatham House. But so we have a pull in two directions. We have the Belarus state under Lukashenko supporting Russia, and Belarusians largely against the war. So with the public opinion at odds with the regime, we need to address this question of whether or not Belarus is still sovereign, and does that matter for nationhood? So Stephen Krasner has four meanings of sovereignty in political debate. So first of all, he talks about what he calls international legal sovereignty. So this basically means, is a state recognized by other states as sovereign? Well, we have to say that Belarus does have international legal sovereignty. It's a member of the United Nations. It was during the Soviet era as well, but that was the anomaly. It's seen as a state that it's legitimate to enter into, just be a signatory of treaties, and other states continue to have a diplomatic presence or ambassadors accredited to Belarus. So in that respect, yes. Then secondly, Krasner discusses what he calls domestic sovereignty, which is does the sovereign who is sovereign have effective control over domestic politics? Well, Lukashenko may have this at Putin's indulgence, but he does have it. That's why he's able to continue repressing society. Tsikhanovskaya, for example, has very little control over domestic politics. Thirdly, interdependence sovereignty. So this is about whether or not you have control over flows across the state's borders, whether it's flows of people, material, or information. Well, if you think Lukashenko didn't know what was about to happen in February last year, or you recognize that he had no control over it, then clearly Belarus doesn't have sovereignty of that kind. And I mentioned information as well. I mean, Russia has long had informational hegemony in Belarus. So in this regard, Belarus does not have, it's not sovereign. And lastly, Westphalian sovereignty. So this is about excluding external actors from domestic authority structures. Well, Lukashenko would like us to believe that it's Western states that meddle in Belarus's sovereignty, but it's pretty clear that Russia has now infiltrated a lot of these domestic authority structures. So again, Putin may indulge Lukashenko, let him think he's in control, but it's very difficult to think that if Putin is unhappy with something, he can't just step in and overrule Lukashenko now. So breaking it down into 4 ways like this, in a way it gives us a messy answer, but if sovereignty is seen as a binary category, are you sovereign or are you not, then it's very hard to say de facto that Belarus at the moment is sovereign, even if de jure it is. So February 2022 is the moment when we come to understand this. So Mr. Lukashenko must have surrendered this at some point up until then. Quite how and when, I can't say, but I place to start would be to look at the union state integration programs. And so he's done this, one would presume, in return for Russia's support to keep him in power. So this is obviously bad for statehood. And if Russia were to annex Belarus formally, then that's even worse. But statehood is not the same as nationhood. So what is the way out here? And so this is where we come back. Given the acute vulnerability of the Lukashenko nation-building project that I've already mentioned, then it's clear that the only way to solve this is more urgent nationalism rooted in a non-Russian, non-Soviet legacy. So the idea of a nation within another state is not unfeasible. Hence, we can have multi-nation states. But as I said, Russia is hell-bent on undoing any nation-building efforts that are express Belarusianness, and kind of insists that Belarusians are really Russians. And so, that's kind of why the Lukashenko project can't work. Can I have the next slide, please? So how have Western actors' policy positions changed since February 2022? Well, I suppose the short answer is that they haven't changed that much. One effect of the war was that attentions and resources were diverted to Ukraine, not surprisingly, and some Belarusians initially felt neglected or abandoned. But actually, the main focus was that it meant that Western policy didn't adjust very much, and the backbone policy in Belarus has remained the same. So that's 2 main components. The first of all of which is sanctions. So I would challenge. These are of questionable value for nation building. I want some audience participation here. So the goal of sanctions, we'll take the European Commission as an example. The European Commission says sanctions are not punitive. They aim to bring about a change in bad or harmful behavior in the target regime. So we'll take the European Commission at its word. Sanctions are the goal of sanctions has always been and is to improve the Lukashenko regime's behaviour. So can we have a show of hands? Who thinks that the Lukashenko regime's behaviour has improved because of sanctions? Okay, and who thinks that it has stayed the same or got worse? Okay, so for the benefit of those that might not see the room, there was no hands for no one here, and we have Belarusian experts, things that they have held in that regard. Now, there may be other reasons for sanctions, and actually I don't think that's what sanctions are about. And usually, as usual, when you do a straw poll, there's the odd person that doesn't raise a hand. But so, sanctions are having effects on the Belarus economy, but effects are not the same as effectiveness. So I'm not, and the second strand of support for of Western policy has been support for Tsikhanovskaya, and that too remains in place. Since she is, again, we need to think about the usefulness of this, given that she is outside the country, and particularly for those in Belarus who are being fed diet of state media, her visibility is very low. And it's interesting I would note as well that to think about why Ukraine hasn't really gone along with either of these strands of policy in during the war. It is rumoured that Ukraine has been discouraging the EU from furthering sanctions on Belarus, for example. And for pragmatic reasons, it has kept some channels open with the Lukashenko regime. And so far as I'm aware, President Zelensky has never met with Tsikhanovskaya. So the war, and yet the war has become the crucial factor deciding the future of Belarusian nationhood. If Russia prevails, then we probably have to assume that it will annex Belarus. If Ukraine prevails, then Lukashenko might still need a nudge, but I would expect that that is the end of his regime. Can we have the next slide? So this is my kind of why the Lukashenko regime is ending. I would call it a contrarian's view, but I'm not sure I'm a contrarian anymore. Back in 2020, I argued that Lukashenko was not about to fall. Now, I think we are far, far closer to the point where his time is up. I think his position is precarious in a couple of ways that it wasn't in 2020. And I'm calling these two reasons the zealots and the militants. So the militants are the Kalinowski regiment, the volunteer fighters in Ukraine, and the idea that the way that other forces have consolidated around them. So they were initially they were the main battalion of Belarusian volunteers, but there were other units. But over time, kind of this is consolidated into a core, and their mission is the liberation of Belarus through the liberation of Ukraine. And so, for example, the cyber partisans, these hacktivists who have been heavily involved in opposition to the regime, back in December, they said that they would announce that they would be more actively cooperating with the Kalinowski regiments. And you saw people like Zenon Pasniak, one of the founders of the Belarusian Popular Front, the carriers of the national idea in the late 80s and early 90s, kind of giving their support. And so some of these nationalist forces are kind of converging around the Kalinowski regiment. And so that may present a more forceful challenge and a more militarized challenge to Lukashenko in the future. And then there's these, so I mentioned earlier, these kind of pro-Putin zealots. So there have been a lot of people in Belarus agitating about any expression of history that is deemed to be not the authorized version under Lukashenko. On Belarusian state TV, there are a lot of Russophiles who are keen to denounce others for not supporting the war, or for and in many respects, these almost, there was a phase back last autumn where tour guides were being denounced for talking about the history of the Grand Duchy, for example, and petitions were being filed to the Prosecutor General to open legal cases against them. And in some respects, some of these people on TV seem to almost be outflanking Lukashenko and pushing him to go farther east. And these have some supporters within the authority structures. So the Lukashenko nation building project, which I mentioned earlier, the vulnerability of which has already been established, so this is now coming about with a vengeance to haunt him. He encouraged people in Belarus, encouraged Belarusians to see themselves as close to Russia. Well, now he risks being hoisted with his own petard. The consequence is that Russia now has more agents of influence in Belarus than it had ever before. And so this is undermining Lukashenko's ability to stay in power. If what I hear and am told is correct, then this is starting to cause ructions in his inner circle. So a lot of these zealots are undermining even the notional idea of Belarus as a nation. So Russia, in this way, is starting to break up the inner sanctum of the Lukashenko regime. So this makes the system unstable, I would posit, in ways that it wasn't in 2020. And that makes some kind of transition of power more likely. So I want to, I will end with 3 scenarios. In discussing these scenarios, I'm making 2 huge assumptions. One is that Belarus has not been annexed to Russia, and the second is that I'm basically excluding Russia from the picture, which is hugely problematic. But if Russia has been emphatically defeated in Ukraine, then that is a possibility. So it's not completely wild. So I want to represent the Belarusian political system as a hub and spokes. Now, the point here is that power is very firmly lodged in the center. It doesn't mean that people in Ministry 1 don't have meetings with people in Ministry 2, that they don't write reports together and things like that, and have independent contacts. But it means that they're primarily focused on implementing policy, monitoring things. They don't actually have real decision-making power. And likewise, enterprises, well, most of the big enterprises are state-owned. So again, power doesn't reside really with the enterprise, it resides in the center. Contrasted with what we might think of as a more typical setup in, say, the UK. Now, again, this is an ideal type, an exaggeration. Even in the UK, power is clearly concentrated in a centre, but there a far greater amount of it is dispersed through other things. I mean, I don't even include civil society actors in this because they've become so marginalised. So that has 2 consequences, this highly centralised form. So firstly, it's why we might think about why sanctions aren't changing policy. If you affect enough of the spokes, nodes on the end of spokes, you might be able to diminish the power in the center, but there's not really the incentive to change. There aren't the network effects that you might get if you are sanctioning in this kind of network system. But more relevantly here, because power in the centre is so centralised, it means that there's something almost concrete or a new group to take control of. So the first scenario is the gloomy scenario. That's that Lukashenko tries to hand off power to an anointed successor. Now, it might work. I think there will be problems, but we can't rule out that it might work. If that happens, this is very bad for nationhood, because it won't help nationhood one jot. It will advance the unbuilding of Belarus as a nation and as a nation state, and entrench it deeper into the Russian world, so-called. The optimistic scenario is that an opposition takes power and is deemed legitimate because they, perhaps because they organize an election very quickly. And this, the people in the ministries who didn't have any power before the transition of power don't have any power afterwards. So there's a continuation of function of state. So that is potentially could be favourable for nation building, but Russia here is a huge problem, and as discussed. But most likely, the third scenario is that there will be some kind of contest for the centre, perhaps both from outside groups, which could be the more militant opposition than there presently is, but also from within the system. It could be that the KGB or the military tries to fight for power. So this is an unhappy scenario. Its effects on nationhood are undecided because there's a contest over who is in control. I don't want to, I don't like being a doom monger, but that's kind of where you start raising the risk of civil war. But before I wander off too far into unfounded speculations, I will end there.
Marvellous. I think we've factored in time for Q&A. Questions from the audience? I don't know if we have a roving microphone.
We'll need to use your mic.
You're going to unhook yourself, Andrew, and then I'll be able to pass it around.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay. If you like,
Lady.
It's your name and.
Yes, first off, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I'm Angela Espinosa from the University of Warsaw, Poland. I apologize for my question, which might have very little practical meaning, but I think it's of capital importance to be completely clear on symbols. So going back to the very beginning of your presentation, you said that, maybe I'm misremembering this, I think I heard that Tikhanovskaya was surrounding herself with white, red, white paraphernalia, yes? How prominent was it really at the beginning of the united Tikhanovskaya, Tsepkala, and Kolesnikova campaign? Because if I recall correctly, Tikhanovskaya's position and the protesters' position was so keen on uniting everyone, or rather maybe even not dividing, that people went out to the streets with both the state and the historical white flag. And it wasn't until Lukashenko's violent response was crystal clear that they renounced the state symbology and stuck to historical pahonia, coat of arms, and white, red, white flag. Thank you.
Yeah, I thank you for the correction, and I agree that I agree with what you just said. I don't think that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was an obvious adopter of a lot of those symbols. That came later in August after when the crackdown intensified.
Gentleman in the Michigan. Looking very old.
Yes. So as you know, Rashid Chaudhry from Manisa Jalal Bayar University in Turkey. You mentioned that it was Belarusian drone operators who managed to damage the Russian plane in Matrulistri. However, according to one of the leaked documents that Jack Teixeira sort of put out into onto Discord, it was actually Ukrainian intelligence operatives. So that is the US assessment. So do we know for sure which of the two it would have been, or did they cooperate? And so, thanks.
Okay, well, my short answer will be no, I don't know. So there was discussion about whether or not they had, from the beginning, about whether Ukrainian intelligence was involved. So yeah, do I remember that there was a suggestion? Okay, so I'm not sure what it says in the leaks, so I can't really comment on that.
You should read them. There.
Tadeusz Gitchen, Center for European Policy Analysis. Thank you, Paul. I know you said that you don't want to go into speculations, but I want to provoke you anyway. I mean, you might not agree, but I think there is a general agreement among political scholars that for a revolution to be successful, one of the conditions that needs to be met is that there should be a split among the elite, that, you know, at some point they would order for some security troops either to put the weapons down or, you know, to switch sides altogether. And do you think it was possible in Belarus and, you know, this elite split in 2020? Or the fact that Lukashenko created such a consolidated and centralized authoritarian regime made the protest doomed, you know, from the start, because it was simply very, very unlikely to happen, and that's what happened. That is, didn't happen.
Sorry, can you say last bit? What was unlikely to happen?
The elite split, that the elite defection, that, you know, the defense minister or the head of the police that would order the troops to, you know, put the weapons down. Because I think everyone think back at the time that it's not going to happen, and that's what made it different from, I don't know, the case of Georgia or Ukraine and other successful revolutions in post-Soviet countries.
So you're saying people thought it had happened?
Sorry.
You're saying people thought it had happened?
No, I think
They thought it was unlikely.
people in general, they didn't take it into account. But, you know, I think from the political scrolls point of view, it's essential. I mean, and
no, I agree. So that's, I mean, I said I was a contrarian. I mean, in August 2020, I wrote out my thoughts in a paper that I circulated to some people. And at that time, I said that I didn't think that the regime was going to fall, and partly it was precisely because of that, that for everything that was happening on the streets, the kind of the core, there wasn't signs of it cracking. Whereas I think now, I think that's different, and I think, I don't know what it will take. I mean, but I think it's far more likely to crack now than it was in 2020. So I think, I mean, I think it's because of these kind of people supported these pro-Putin zealots, and the fact that within the core, I mean, it's hard because I only have access. Well, I have access probably to the same information as everyone else in this in the general public. But I think Russia now has a lot more agents of influence, and there are. There have been moments where people have publicly disagreed with each other within the regime. Shred, the prosecutor general, has kind of overruled other people that you wouldn't expect to have been overruled. So I think that kind of, we can start to see hints that there's division within. But you know, you sort of get into the realm of Kremlinology for or whatever you call it in the context of Belarus.
Maybe the scenario isn't division because there are factions in a very personalized regime. It's more just a case of things get so bad that everybody
The factional infighting
decides
comes
on
from-
change.
Oh,
And then perhaps people start fighting over succession.
mm.
Yeah. Yarrick, and then I've seen you over there.
Two questions. The first question, do you agree that until Russia is busy with its own internal affairs, there is no chance of Belarus moving sort of into a more liberal direction, let's put it this way? And the second question, some people say that when sanctions are imposed, we need to stick to principles and wait until all political prisoners are released or no sanctions are relaxed. Other people say we need to fight for every person and bargain with the regime and offer concessions. What matters is whether we can get people out of prisons. Which view do you personally prefer?
Okay, sorry, what was the first question?
First question is, do you agree
yeah,
that
first question about liberalizing.
Second about political prisoners.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree that Russia, if it can help it, is not going to allow that to happen in Belarus. That's a big problem. I think it's less and less likely now than it was a few years ago. Now that Russia is enmeshed in a war which it launched. So that's the answer to the first question. Second question: political prisoners. So the division was between fighting for every person behind bars, as opposed, and what was the other option?
So some people say here are the sanctions, and unless you release everyone, we're not going to move from this. Just release everyone, all sanctions will not be relaxed. Other people say the main point is to get people out of prisons, and if we have to bargain, if you have to offer concessions, if you have to relax sanctions, that's how it works.
I don't know. I mean, I'm conscious that most people in this room probably know people who are in prison. And that's the point of where it gets difficult to answer these questions, because in terms of EU, UK, US, they clearly can't engage with the Lukashenko regime. Lukashenko is delegitimized. That's over. That game's up. The only thing they can do in respect to the regime is ease sanctions, I suppose, but that's when it's done. Well, yeah, limited option what that will really achieve. I mean, Lukashenko may. I suppose the thing is, we've been through it repeatedly, where he has released a handful of political prisoners, been rewarded for it, and then he's rearrested people and put them back in prison. So he's kind of, he's playing that, or he's played that in the past. Yeah. So.
Peter, gentleman here.
Thank you. Christian from Sheffield Uni. I have two questions. The first one was, how likely do you think it is for Belarus to join Russia in the war? Do you think by this stage, we lost that train? And the second one was about the scenarios, speculating. For any of the three scenarios that you think, do you think there's any hope of any peaceful outcome, even if it's not the most democratic out of them? Or do you think that there's going to be probably some?
Well, on the first question, I don't think Belarus can add very much to the war effort. As I said, they've got 47,000 active personnel, there's reserved a few 100,000, but Putin has more reserves in Russia that he can draw on. Although Russia has been sending people to their deaths, but it has been sending a lot of people. It's Wagner Group taking people out of prisons. It's not been sending perhaps its fittest fighters. So I think it's unlikely that Putin would command the involvement of Belarusian troops. And the fact that the war is unpopular in Belarus means that it would be a way of spreading the war, and that would make it more complicated for Russia. So no, I don't think so. And the second question, so I mean, the second scenario I did try to present as the more optimistic one. It's possible. We have to believe that everything is possible. But I would be lying if I said I thought the path ahead is easy for Belarusians. Right now it is, in a way, the most vulnerable state in Europe because it could be annexed very easily at any moment, and who would respond outside of Belarus to that? But we hope.
I just checked on the online audience. There are no questions in the chat, but do feel free. You can ask questions too. Yes, I'm talking. And in the real world.
Hi, so my name is Edward Snyder. During the first year of the war in Ukraine, I was serving as an intelligence officer with the Ukrainian military. After I finished my mission with that, I came to the conclusion that Ukraine will win and have moved on to the next issue, which is Belarusian sovereignty. And in my studies and everything, I noticed that there was a very influential politician named Vladimir Mackay who died of natural causes last November. And you just happened to say during your presentation something about Russia wanting to break up the inner sanctum of Lukashenko regime. So I was wondering, maybe in your opinion, based on conjecture, like I know that it's not confirmed and maybe it really was a heart attack, but do you think that there are any other prime candidates for death by natural causes? Or falling out of windows or downstairs? Any variation of accidental or natural death?
Well, it's a wonderful question, Edward Snyder. Not one that I really feel I would like to answer. I
think the most recent version is that it's suicide.
Yeah. So I mean, on Mackay, Nasha Neva originally reported that it was a heart attack. I don't think there was no official kind of statement of cause of death. Inevitably, there were conspiracy theories that the Russian actors had eliminated him. And then more recently, it's been rumored that he took his own life because of personal problems. I don't know. He was a man in his middle 60s, probably under a lot of pressure. It's quite plausible that he had a heart attack. I know your question is not that. I suppose what I would say is that if this were Russia helping people to die by natural causes, I would expect to see some people be associated with. Yes, you might, if you had a few cases, then you might start thinking, okay, there's something wrong here. Mackay was not a liberal, but he was. He was foreign minister. It was his job to try to have relations with states with EU states and the US and such forth. So yeah, I wouldn't sort of buy into the idea that he was liberalizing in the way that some people seem to suggest. But yeah, I mean, people, I mean, probably I sorry, I'm not going to give a name. I'm not going to name people. Here's the death list.
I'm just not as familiar with the inside workings of Lukashenko's personal circle, so.
Yeah, but you know, I'm not. People in policy circles, they come up with this phrase, not being cited. You come across that a lot, I'm sure. I'm not cited.
Any other questions? Comments?
Thank you very much for your very insightful talk, even if depressing. So Natalia Chernyshova, Queen Mary University of London. You mentioned very briefly that when Ukraine wins the war, that probably spells the end of the Lukashenko regime, but it might need a little nudge. And you kind of addressed that, I suppose, in your three scenarios, but maybe you could elaborate on what that nudge could be, or where it would come from. And
well, I think it would probably come from those people fighting in Ukraine as volunteers. I can't really see where else it would come from.
how do you envisage them becoming a political force?
Well, it's going to have, I mean, so, I mean, there are things like this sort of victory plan that supposedly has a couple of 100,000 people signed up to it. So you're nodding, so you know something about that. That, you know, something like that would need to be effected. You know, I suppose what I'm saying is that Lukashenko doesn't just fall because Ukraine wins. You know, that's, I don't, you know, something has to happen to actually remove him from power.
Right. I mean, I think that's a big question, isn't it? That what would happen? It just occurred to me that when the war just started and there was this big rally in Trafalgar Square in support of Ukraine, and Belarusians went there. I did as well. And I remember riding a train with a Ukrainian man with his little boy going to the same rally, as it turned out. And somehow we got talking, a complete stranger, but he said, "Are you from Belarus?" And he said, "Well, don't worry, we'll win this war and then we'll sort you guys out." And I felt like, you know, nice of you to say, but I think we need to sort ourselves out. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, but your best bet is Kalinowski Regiment. Right?
I think a victorious Ukraine will have enormous relative power in Eastern Europe, and it would be a legitimate war aimed to topple Lukashenko. So it's not just the Kalinowski Regiment, also
Okay.
the Ukrainian state.
Well, there's a
I think
clear,
it's-
cleaner answer for you.
Anything online?
Well, once we are done, Alan Flowers will say if you're watching how we're done with the Russian society, but I think that
we mentioned-
So we invite him to say a few words.
And remember to, can we,
Thank you, Professor Wilson. Thank you, Andrew. And just very briefly, this is the word from your sponsor. I gather from Ryan, you've already been enjoying the wine and sandwiches, which may have led to the very lively and useful discussion that we've had as well. A couple of points. I mean, I've been listening without intervening at a time when sovereignty of Belarus, the culture, the traditions are so under question. Obviously, societies like Anglo-Belarusian society and conferences in particular like this are just so hugely important. And that, of course, has already been voiced by many. I only add to the power of that. Got many visitors from abroad here, but I would want everybody to know that the Anglo-Belarusian Society, which you can find online on Facebook, and it's got its website, we do run a lot of hybrid meetings and events, so you can come in online. And it's a way to keep your engagement with the English-speaking Belarusian international community, particularly the one based here in the United Kingdom, and to join in various events. We had a very fine Chernobyl commemoration event, for example, last Saturday from the Church of St. Cyril, with a beautiful short 30-minute service in Belarusian. So ways for all people here and everybody listening in, you're cordially invited not only to enjoy the sponsored reception of the Anglo-Belarusian Society, but please do join in our events. We do email out information on meetings. So if we get your email addresses, and Yarek's there, he can explain how to do that. You can look online, look onto Facebook, and you'll be able to communicate with the Anglo-Belarusian Society. And as a final personal word for myself, Alan Flowers, I'm very sorry not to be able to be in London again attending this important conference. I'm speaking to you from Edinburgh, where my wife and I now stay, and she unfortunately was hospitalized a little while ago and is now recovering, but I have to be up here in Edinburgh, or else I would have been personally there. My name, Alan Flowers, Belarus. I do a lot of broadcasts now on TVP World in English, and some of the matters discussed. I'd give the assembled academics here the reference, TV Poland, TVP World. They run very interesting English language discussion programs. So it's another medium in which all these questions are continuously being discussed. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to joining you online tomorrow morning. And congratulations to everybody. That's been a very great first day. And thank you. I hope you enjoy the Anglo-Belarusian Society sponsored reception today.